Hello, hello to my True Blue crew. This is kind of a pop-up live stream on Sunday. We've got to swap some things around during the holiday season since our regular Wednesday sew and chat falls on Christmas Eve. I figured people will be out with family, enjoying the season, church services, all those other kinds of obligations, and it's not a good time for a live stream. There will be a tutorial out on Wednesday, but today we need to catch up and get a few more blocks done for the Holidaze Sampler. This is a series that I've been working on for this quilt. It's got 9 blocks, and I've shared most of them. But today we're going to be working on the candle first. And this pattern, the links to my shop are in the video description below, so you can download those patterns while they're on sale. Hello, Misty. Good to have you in. What are you working on today? So this candle block is a little bit of paper piecing and some traditional piecing. So let me get that started. And I have to warn you that one of my cats is rambling around at my feet. So we'll see how that goes. And I've got all my pieces cut. You can see in the workspace camera. And I'm just searching for the paper foundation. The key part of paper piecing is you need the pattern. And these two small rows, simple piecing, form the flame of the candle. So I just print out my paper piece, my FPP patterns on regular printer paper, and then I trim. They've got a dotted line for the seam allowance, but I trim even a little bit beyond that. And I'm using my normal craft scissors and not my fabric scissors. So we'll get these 2 rows ready. And the thing about paper piecing, at least with me, is I use scraps and I audition pieces. So I try to give people a minimum measurement in my patterns that will work for the components, but you have to audition, and especially these pieces with the angles that we're going to be doing for this flame, the triangle in the center, you're going to need oversized pieces. So just take note of that. And I also want to label, this is background on the ends and my yellow in the center. Not that I'll get too confused this afternoon because it's such a quick and easy design, but it's a good habit to get into. That way you're always looking at the colors that you need. And Misty says she is working on a tote. And Lori is here. Good to see you too, Lori. Okay, so I'm going to do the smaller row first. And to start paper piecing, like I said, I use an oversized piece of fabric, and it's just going to go right there in the center of this block. And you can pin that first piece. I like to use fabric glue, and this is the Sew Line fabric glue, and I just put a dab of glue there to hold that first piece in place. And then for this pattern, I'm trying to make sure I have enough room here to get all the components going. Okay, so we've got our first piece of fabric in place, and we need to fold the paper. So my first seam line, I'm going to take a business card and set it right on that line and fold the paper. So I'm folding the paper back. and I'm looking at the fabric underneath. And then I'm going to put my add a quarter ruler in place and trim off that fabric. So fold, trim are the first two steps. And then I can add my next piece of fabric right in line with what I just cut. And as you can see, I am using a great big piece of fabric, but I am auditioning for how I need to place this fabric and fold it back so that it covers the paper. I can see the paper underneath. And that's why you need to use such an oversized piece of paper, because the angles on this make it tricky when you sew them together. So I will probably have to update the pattern to make sure that you start with big enough pieces. Lori, what are we working on this afternoon? Hopefully you have something fun. And then we're ready to sew. Once you fold, trim, add a piece, and then you sew. And I reduce my stitch length. I go down to 1.6 actually for my paper piecing. That way everything rips off nice and easy. And I wish I had a better another camera that was a little more portable that I could show you. I mentioned my cat, and I set the sampler that I showed you at the beginning of all the finished blocks. I put it down on the floor, and she has tucked herself underneath the folds of the quilt. So she is just looking super cute down there. That's a good spot for you, kitty. Okay, and then we're just going to sew right on the line through the paper and our 2 layers of fabric. And it's a very short seam. And actually, I can start this. No, I can't, because I need the scrap from here. Never mind. I was going to try and chain piece, but we're not ready for that. And get my little leader ender out of the way there. And then we put this piece back, and let's make sure, yep, I've got plenty. I'm holding it up to the light so I can see, and I've got fabric covering the entire area that I need, even though this looks like a really wonky block or what, whatever you want to call it. It's all lined up the way it needs to be on the actual paper. So then we just repeat the process. I come to my next line, I fold the paper, get my ruler lined up so I can trim my fabric. And then that piece is going to go on the next row. Fold your paper back flat, flip it over, and same thing. We're going to position this fabric right on the edge that I just cut and fold it back, make sure it covers where it needs to, and we are good to go on this one. Carefully, and again, if you need pins to hold your pieces in place and go, that's fine. I just hold very carefully, keeping my fabrics lined up, and I go right under the needle. Lori, I see your comment. I'm glad the ruler arrived and you're having fun playing with it. Some of the earlier blocks use half rectangle triangles, and my little bit different ruler helps you make those units. So that's what Lori is talking about. These are also available on my website. Check the video description for a coupon. And Lori is planning to drive from Georgia to California for a show in January. Well, if your travels bring you through Phoenix, we definitely need to stop for I'll meet you at the gas station for a Coke. That's fine. Or we could grab coffee, or I can take you to lunch or dinner, however it works out. But I'm very jealous that you get to go to that show. I was hoping to get over there. Obviously, Phoenix, it's pretty easy to get over to LA, but that week of Road to California, I have a mandatory work event. So I couldn't make that journey this year. But as I get closer to retirement, we will definitely start planning more quilt travels. And Amanda is here. So good to see you, Amanda. I heard you've been recovering, and I hope everything is going well and that you're able to get ready and enjoy Christmas along with your recovery. Okay, so that row is done. So I'm going to go ahead and get this next row ready for piecing. And again, since it's the first piece, I'm going to put a dab of glue to hold that fabric in place. And then I can decide which side I want to. I only cut 2 pieces of fabric and I needed 4. So that's, I'm scatterbrained today. I'm trying to think where I put the scraps. Will be 8. Well, I was thinking I might be able to use these scraps on the next piece. We'll have to see when I trim. Okay, so this piece looks very funky because of those angled seams, but I am going to trim it right into a straight row. And you can see on the camera that the fabric covers that whole straight rectangle that I was working with. So I am not worried about how funky it looks during those intermediate steps. See, I'm trying to think if that, as you can see, I'm auditioning. The fabric covers the space, but it's the angle that I'm worried about. So I will have to play with that some more when I finish this first row. So do we have experienced paper piecers, or do you prefer other techniques? Let me know in the chat. We do get kind of a messy scrap area, but there is the very tip top of the flame for our candle block. And then I can see if, okay, so I've got that glued in place. And we're going to fold. I always have to chant those steps: fold, trim, add a piece, and sew. Got the fold and trim, and then we audition. And is that gonna, ooh. No, I don't. Let's see if I can adjust that a little bit. Sometimes you can adjust how you do your starting seam. I don't quite have enough for the seam allowance. So let me find my other fabric. Nope, I didn't have any close by. Excuse me for 1 second. Another scrap of background. And when you use big oversized pieces, you can see on my workspace camera, I will have plenty of that when I fold it back. So that is one of the drawbacks of paper piecing. Sometimes because of the severe angles, you have to use really oversized pieces, and that ends up with a little bit of waste. Of course, these are big enough scraps to use in other projects. So there is that. Oh, Amanda is working on the woven star. I did that. Oh gosh, it's been almost a year since I was working on that. Those are some paper pieced patterns from Fat Quarter Shop. I know Sean of The Guy Who Sews and Katie from Greenland Quilter are also using those woven stars for a paper piece project, and they're just gorgeous. So have fun with that. It does not matter if it's slow. It is not a race. And we're sewing on the line. Double checking. Oh, I've just got the tiny little corner. And I can trim off the end here since I want to use that, the remainder of that scrap. So a lot of times when I paper piece, I'll just cut a width of fabric of the color I'm using and then just keep, chopping it off as I use bits for the pattern. And here we'll have the second paper pieced section almost done. And that's all you need for the candle. So now, like I said, since that's all I need for the candle, I am going to come to some of the traditional pieced parts. We need a couple half square triangles. So I've paired my fabrics and I'm doing the 2 at a time method. So I'm going to sew on either side of a diagonal line to make these little half square triangles. They're going to be so cute. Then I have a nice size scrap of that left over. These 2 rows for the candle are not the same size. Just had to be a little funky here. And part of this is these are my little bit different quilt blocks. So of course they're a little bit different. Okay, and your row should be 6.5 inches wide because our block finishes at 6 inches. Lori has never paper pieced. Oh, girlfriend, you need to give it a try. Yes, it is upside down and backwards because you are working on, it's in reverse. So the pattern that you're looking at is on the back of your block. So it is in reverse. Like I have done a quilt last March, April timeframe, I was doing some letters, and you paper piece the letters, and the pattern is backwards because you're looking at the back. But then when you flip it around, everything's right side up. So once you get over that hurdle, Lori, you can do well. Well, hello, Cheryl. Welcome. Cheryl is also new to paper piecing. This is an easy block to get started because you just have these 2 simple rows that only have 2 seams each. So you're all set. So my next step is I need to match these triangles for the flame of my candle. So we will, actually, I'm going to move this. Not trying to be super secretive, but my pattern handout has dimensions on it, and this is a paid pattern, so I am not giving away those measurements for free today, but they are on sale on my website. So if you want to grab it now at the lowest price you'll ever see it, hop on over to truebluequilts.com. Patty is here. Good to see you too. Also a fan of paper piecing. And so this is funny. She's using the abbreviations FPP and EPP. F stands for foundation, and E is English. There are 2 different kinds of paper piecing. English paper piecing is most often or most commonly hexagons. You use little paper cutouts and wrap your fabric around it and sew it together. So that's a different technique than foundation paper piecing, which is when the whole pattern is printed on the paper and you sew through. Amanda also does EPP. I've got a really long-term hexy project that I probably won't ever finish. It's just kind of an amusing side project that I dig out like once every 2 or 3 years. Yeah, and Amanda, if you take a break from paper piecing, it does take a minute to remember all those steps, but they're just 4 things you need to remember: fold, trim, add a piece, sew, and that gets you through the steps. Okay. So like I said, I am matching my triangles together. And they don't have to be super exact. You know, we're done is better than perfect in my book. I am not going to stress over getting those seams exactly matched up, but you can eyeball where they hit together pretty easily. Okay. And since I have paper on both sides for this section, it is not going to feed through my machine as well. For some reason, your feed dogs don't grab paper as well as they grab fabric. So I am going to just be really careful and make sure this is feeding through my machine nice and steady. And sewing on the 1/4 inch seam line of my pattern. Just like anything else. And then, as I said, I was doing some chain piecing, and I've got one side of my 2 at a time half square triangles going. So we will sew the other seam on that one. And then the very bottom of the candle, like the dish that it's sitting in, you use you sew and flip corners. That's what we're doing. So I've already drawn the diagonal on those pieces of fabric, so I can quick sew that together as well. Okay, so I've got my half square triangle. I decided to use some nice Christmassy holiday fabric, pine cones and holly berries and things. And those are my two little half square triangles. I can go ahead and snip the corners for the dog ears right now. Once I get all my pieces together, I will get out the iron and press all these units. So we're ready to go. But I've got my candle flame all paper pieced together. So that means I can take off the paper. So over here on my workspace, I am just holding those edges and trying to rip towards the stitches. And I'm doing that seam section first. And flip it over to do the other side. And then we can gently pull that paper away from the stitches because we ripped off one side, so that should pop loose pretty easily, and then just rip down the opposite side. And if things get stuck, you can come back with tweezers to if it bothers you. I figure that paper, you know, is a fairly natural substance. You know, who knows how they treat it and bleach it and all that kind of stuff. But if a little bit of paper ends up in the middle of my quilt sandwich, I'm not too worried about it. Okay, so then popping out that center section, you just kind of bend down and then I can get beneath it, and that last bit pulls away. I've got one little scrap that I need to pick away. So there's one half of my candle flame, and then take the paper off the other side quickly. And same thing, pop that center one out. And we are all set with our flame. And I always just remember that the top triangle, the smaller one, goes on top. The bigger one is going to go down to the base of our candle. So that's ready for that. And then I decided in my first sample, I did a pink candle. And today I just had a pretty red there. So that we have the tall pillar of our candle just gets sewn here between some background pieces. And then I can come back and sew the opposite corner. Now, the thing to remember is that your diagonals go in two different directions on this base unit. So you want them like slanting into the middle. Okay, and then I've got another short piece of the candle that has to be part of the row with the dish. So I'm sewing that together. This I can finger press and sew it to my other background piece. Have to talk to myself to stay organized with all these pieces. Okay, so we are ready to press. So let me clean up a little bit with these scraps, some of these larger ones. I always have such a dilemma. It's hard for me to throw away tiny scraps, but I don't ever do anything with such tiny pieces. So I got a paper trash can and a fabric trash can. So that's how I keep things going there. And then I need to trim the outer corners. So be careful when you're trimming that piece for the dish, the base of the candle. Okay, and then I can start my iron heating up and get my pressing mat in place, and we can do some initial finger pressing to lay all these components out together. Okay, I goofed on this one. I decided I wanted it to, even though the red is the darker fabric, I want this candle portion to be pressed to the background so that it will nest with the bottom row. Okay, so there's that. And then that part, very bottom of the candle, I need to iron these little half square triangles because they make the other part of the dish here. And then, of course, we have our paper piecing. And a lot of times I just press the paper pieced section open. Okay, so we will press that. There's my flame. And we will, we wanted that to go to the outsides. So there is our base of our candle. You can see how these okay, so there we go. And I'm going to quick get these. Oh, you know what I didn't do is I didn't trim my half square triangles to the right size. When you do two at a time half square triangles, you need to remember to come back to your units and trim them. I was about ready to sew, and they would have been just that little bit too big. Okay, and then I have to remember which way they are going on each side of my row. This one, same thing. Okay, so I can match that candle flame up to the middle of the base of the candle, the pillar, and sew those two rows together, getting a little bit of chain piecing going here. And here is the top of our dish with the candle in the center. And I will press that to the background just so it all lays flat. And then you just match it up there. And okay, there we have our dish with our, oh, isn't that funny how those holly berries lined up right underneath the candle portion? So good job there. Thank you, universe, for cooperating with me. And here is the top of our candle. And then we just join the top and the bottom. This one I did plan ahead, and so my seams nest. So you can go ahead and pin just those center seams where your candle needs to line up. Yep. I knew I was going to run out of bobbin, and I'm almost running out of my top spool at the same time. Isn't that crazy? So let me move that out of the way and replace. Okay. everything back up. I always start a few stitches over again to I don't know where my top thread was, just to secure that when I am in the middle of a seam. I'm going to start a new thread tab here because I have used those up. Those are ready for the waste bin. Okay, just like that, about 45 minutes, and we've got our candle block for the little bit, or the Holidaze Sampler. These are a little bit different blocks. They trim to 6x9. Finish at 6x9. Trimmed 6.5 by 9.5 in your quilt. I just have embraced the challenge of this different block size and have really enjoyed making holiday blocks this year with this block size. So it was fun coming up with the different elements that I wanted to include and coming up with the patterns for them. So that's the candle block. I have one more for you. And it's very sad because I have to disturb the cat. I told you she was napping next to the sample. So this is Tommy. She's our little, just about a year old. My daughter adopted her. And since my daughter's not home, she hangs out with me in the sewing room. And she's a sweetheart, still really playful. But like I said, the Holidaze Sampler, we did the candle. The Santa hat is free for a few more days. We did a wreath. We did a tree. That's an ornament. And I hand stitched the hook on the top. It's just in gold thread and it doesn't show up on camera. I realize that when you're doing embroidery on quilt blocks, you could probably use several strands of DMC floss. You don't have to limit yourself to just one and it would show up better. And then we did an elf suit and the present. You saw that as part of Quiltmas. I used that block in a zipper pouch. And so the bonus block for today is the snowflake. We also are going to paper piece that block as well. And all these patterns are linked in the description below. I decided for this second version of the snowflake that I am going to use green as my background and a very soft, this is actually gray fabric, so that will give me a nice snowflake combination there, the gray and the green. So these long pieces are going to join the paper pieced sections later on. So we set those aside. I'm going to set aside my candle block. And for the snowflake, you actually need to print 2 copies of the foundation pattern. There's a right and a left corner, and there's, you know, just the one page, and then you just print a second page, and that gives you the 4 corners of the snowflake that you need. And like I said, I just use regular computer paper. So I am trimming these down to the sections that I actually need. So we're going to end up with 8 triangles to sew here, but there's only 3 colors in each one. There's 2 backgrounds and a white stripe for the snowflake. So let me, and you can, it just depends how close you want your pattern to go to the edge. It really doesn't matter. Sometimes that having that extra paper in there gets annoying. So you really only need small bits for this one because the corners are so small. They're only about 3 by 4 finished. So and the pattern, the foundation pattern, kind of grays out one side. So that's nice because then you don't really have to worry about keeping colors straight. The gray area is your background. The white area is your snowflake fabric. And they're lettered and numbered. So it really is like color by number. And so the C and D triangles go together. The A and the B triangles go together. Get this last section done, and then we can just chain piece these. Get my paper scraps out of the way, and we are, whoops. Okay, I don't need my pressing mat for the moment, so that's going to go away because I will need to be doing some cutting. So I want to have my cutting mat all set up. Okay, I am going to just cut off some chunks here that I will use for the snowflake area. And as you can see, auditioning them, you want to make sure you have seam allowance. So I want to go across that section of the paper. So if I get a few chunks cut out, then I can start. Actually, I need 8, don't I? Yeah. And you can see I'm just improv cutting. I don't really need to pay attention to any specific dimension on these. Let me count. Let's see. Yep. Okay. And then I do want to, let's see, these will be these can be the toppers that are smaller bits. 4, 6, and we'll do it like that. But then I need a little bit larger section. You can see this, the bottom portion there is a little bit bigger. So I will make sure I can cover that. And so I need a 3 or 4 inch chunk to make sure I cover that whole portion of the triangles. Is it big enough for that? Okay. So I will make all my sections that big. Okay. So we are starting off just like we did before. And for step one, you put the wrong side of the fabric with the wrong side of the paper. And with my batik, doesn't really matter. So I am going to, again, put a daub of glue in that section one area and then glue my first fabric in place. Okay, and then this one is a do I have 4 there? A, B, D, I need this C. Okay, so we've got our first fabric in place, and then I'm just going to come along and I need to fold my paper. So I'm going to fold that and then find my add a quarter ruler. And that fabric will be big enough for one of those other pieces. And then we're going to add the next piece of fabric, which is my gray for the snowflake. And I just line that up. And since I've lined it up on this edge, since I am going to do a little bit of chain piecing here, I am setting that aside before I sew those pieces together. So if that makes you nervous and you need to pin, then go right ahead. And we'll set those aside for the second group of blocks. And we're laying these in place and double checking that they cover the area they need to cover, which is not a problem at this stage. Sometimes it gets a little tricky to remember which section you're sewing next. So just keep the numbering system in mind and go in order. So we need to sew on the line between section 1 and 2. Okay, so I've got 4 little sections here that I am working on. So I can just chain piece those. Whoops. And sew all the way through my leader ender piece. And then I want the needle up so that I can position my paper right underneath the needle and sew on the line. There was one. You don't need to sew through the seam allowance. That's why I am adjusting this. If you take 1 or 2 stitches into the seam allowance, that's fine. I just don't ever sew all the way across. And number before. Back to the beginning, grab my little thread tab. And I'm going to finger press these all out. Before we add our next piece of fabric. Oh, Lori is saying that I'm making it look easy. I have done many, many, many paper piece projects, so the flow of the steps is pretty easy. And I'm also really familiar with this pattern. It's my original design. I've sewn it before, so I know how the pieces are going. So don't be discouraged if you try it and it looks a little bit awkward in person because you're just getting used to these things. Like I said, I designed this pattern. I know every step before it happens, where you may have to go back and check the pattern. You may have to rewatch the video to see how it goes together. Simone, am I saying that right? Welcome in. Glad to have you here on the channel today. I am making some paper pieced snowflakes at the moment. So I just sewed the first two pieces of fabric together, and I am finger pressing right along that seam, all 4 pieces, and then I will start the process all over again to add the next piece of fabric. And I didn't press these scraps ahead of time, so some of them are not really behaving very well in my stack. Okay, so we start at the beginning again. All my fabric is 1 layer flat, and I have turned it over, so I'm looking at the paper again. I am going to line up between section 2 and 3, the next line I need to sew, and I am going to fold on the line and trim the fabric. Step 1, step 2, fold and trim. And then I'm going to let the paper lie flat again, flip it over to the fabric side, and add my next piece of fabric right on that line. And I'm going to audition and make sure that if I put the fabric in that orientation, it covers the section, but it doesn't give me a full seam allowance. So I'm going to rotate my scrap because I have enough to go the length of the seam. And now that I've gone the other direction, I have much more length of my fabric, and it will give me the seam allowance that I want. So yes, I have lined up that piece, so that can set aside while I get these other pieces ready to go as well. Fold the paper, trim the fabric, and I'm using the add a quarter ruler. Is my handy companion when I am paper piecing. Love it, love it. Yes, when you're paper piecing small bits, sometimes it's an optical illusion. You don't think you have the seam allowance you need, but you actually do, because the actual area where the pattern is so small. So again, I am folding the fabric, or folding the paper, trimming the fabric, adding the next piece of fabric. And these are pretty tiny scraps that I'm using, but I have just a very small tip of the block that I need to cover with that background. Last one. Practice makes perfect. So we fold the paper, trim the fabric, add the next piece, and then we are ready to sew. And this, I think, is one that needs to be in the vertical position. And I can take that right to the machine and sew on the line. I raise the needle in between each one because I want to get this paper right underneath so the needle is lined up to sew on the line. And I think if I were ever going to do a class for you guys on paper piecing, I would need to move my camera so you could actually see what I'm doing under the needle there. My little chain of 4 triangles. Okay, we will cut those apart. Okay, so this is what our snowflake sections look like so far. They're just these tiny little bits of white on our background fabric. And you can see what it looks like from the back. We've got fabric hanging off the edges. I'm going to trim right to this dotted line on my pattern. That's the seam allowance, and put those together. But as I said, these are only 4 of the triangles and I need 8. So I'm going to set these aside and repeat the process for my other sections. So you will need, if you download the snowflake pattern from True Blue Quilts, you will need to print 2 copies of the foundation. Okay, so let's see here. We want goes that way. I think I'm going to be okay with this. Whoops. Is my workspace going to come back? Sorry about that. Telephone call interrupted. Let's see if we can. Nope. Okay. Let me get that camera set up again. Excuse me. Talk amongst yourselves. What are you hoping Santa brings you this year? That's the problem with using your phone as the, nope, it's still not, hang on. I did not have a very big wish list this year. I'm talking as I get my camera set up again. There are some books that I've liked. I love Jim Shore Santas and snowmen, actually, that their Santa's outfit and the base of the snowman, they're all quilt blocks. They're so cool. And I've got a few of them in my collection of holiday decorations. And so I asked, my daughter's like all bummed. She's like, really? You only want that one thing? Well, yes, honey. I don't need a lot of doodads. We're trying to decrease the clutter in the house. I don't need more stuff to just put on a shelf. So, okay. Oh, goodness. Since that's not showing up here. I'm going to have to do that all over again. What a bummer. And it's, you know, spam phone calls. So let me do that all again. Okay, another delay. Oh, there we go. I hid my own video from myself. Okay, I am back in action after that phone call, and we are ready to paper piece the other 4 sections that we need for this snowflake. So I'm going to put some glue on that section, and oh, I got it over. Just if you didn't get it placed right, just move it over. And there, that gives me the seam allowance that I need on that one. And then same thing with this vertical one. Ooh, that one wasn't quite wide enough. So let's try this bigger piece. Okay, much better. Okay, and then I need some that are about that big. And our very last one. Okay, so I've got my pattern attached to the back of my fabric. And then I am just using my little scraps here because I just have to cover this little section that's about the tip of my finger. And so that will work. So then we put a postcard or an index card or something just to give us some bulk when we fold the paper and trim that one layer of fabric. Put that in our scrap pile, get our paper lined up again, and then add the next piece of fabric right to that trimmed line here. And I can set that aside because I have 3 more to prepare in the same way. Fold the paper, trim the fabric, add the next piece, and then we're ready to sew. And I am just deciding which of these is the right side of that fabric. Sometimes it's hard to tell. If it's that hard to tell, no one else will probably notice either. Okay, and then these are a little bit longer. Yes, I do have enough. The orientation of the stripes on the triangle changes if you're going across the long way or the short way. So keep that in mind on these blocks. And I'm going to addition, make sure I got that. Yes, it is in a good place. And last one. Fold, trim, add a piece, sew. Okay. And then we are ready with our shorter stitch length for these paper pieced blocks. The little beeps you hear are me raising and lowering my presser foot and my needle here on my machine. And then I can trim apart my paper sections. Snipping those threads. Okay. Just a little bit more on this paper piecing step. We have our little tips of fabric to put in place, and I've got these scraps that I can just cut in half, and that will be plenty for these little tips that I need. The tip of the snowflake, the very corner edge that'll probably get lost in the seam allowance at some point, but we just have to get to the edge of our block. And you can see that one wasn't lined up very well. I have just a tiny bit of seam allowance on that one. So hopefully that holds together and I don't end up with holes in my block. But you can reinforce that later if you need to. And I always think of alternate methods to do things when I am working on quilt patterns. And if you wanted a snowflake block, once you see how this is all laid out, you know, I basically did an asterisk, and you could lay that out with white rick rack would be a fun little project, or just some decorative stitching lines across a background piece of fabric if you wanted to do a snowflake block. Or cut out, you know, like you used to do paper snowflakes, cut out a snowflake and applique it down. So many options for sampler quilts. Oh dear, I didn't look at that. I'm gonna have to go back and check one of my other pieces to make sure it gives me, is it this guy? Remember I said some of the pieces go vertical and some of them are horizontal, so you want to double check that the way you've laid out the fabric gives you the full coverage across your pattern and the seam allowance. Okay, we are ready to go on this one. Okay, so I've got my other 4 sections done. So that means we are ready to press everything and start assembling. Okay. I said press and assemble. First, I have to trim everything down to the edge of my pattern. So we're not quite ready for that. And I am going to stand up for a minute, and that gives me a better angle here on my cutting table. So I'm lining up my ruler just to the printed edge of the seam allowance and trimming away whatever paper and fabric is left. There. Make sure everything is folded out the correct way on the block. That little guy didn't fold out correctly, so I'm going to need to redo that. There we go. And then there are a couple little angles here at the tip to make sure you have a seam allowance around that pointy triangle. So just follow the lines as you're trimming. And there we have one section of a snowflake corner. And there's 8 triangles. So this cutting step is going to take me a minute. So I'd love to hear from my audience if you have time off over the holidays. Did you plan your vacations around this? Do you have family coming in town? Are you retired and don't have to worry about vacation requests? I'm actually going to be the only one in my office. It's kind of funny. I took my travel days at Thanksgiving, which means that I'm holding down the fort here over the next 2 weeks while everybody else is gone. But it's, you know, people are pretty understanding about that. And obviously my heart goes out to all the first responders, hospital staff that works over the holidays. It must get kind of tedious hearing everybody talk about time off if you have to work. And retail also, sending special good wishes for patients in the stores at this crazy time of shopping. Trimming can be a tedious step, but it definitely makes things turn out better in the long run. Okay. Nope, 2 more. It's like, am I at the bottom of my stack yet? No, yes, 2 more. I always enjoy those of you that have chosen to hang out with me on these live sessions, and a shout out to all of our replay viewers. Feel free to comment with what you're working on as well. Say hi in the chat. I live in Arizona, so these paper-pieced snowflakes are as close as I want to get these days. I did I've spent some years of my life up in Colorado, Idaho, South Dakota, so I understand snow in the wintertime, but these days I much prefer my desert weather. Okay, so as I was explaining, we have some portions of our snowflake that sit vertically tall on our snowflake and triangle, and some stripes that sit horizontal. Okay, and as you're looking at the back, these pieces have letters on them, letters and numbers. Focusing on the letters, we want to match the A and the B triangles together to kind of make a rectangle. And we are going to piece a strip in between there. And I want to make sure that I line that up so that I'm going to have a 4.5 inch block. So, yeah, I want to use a piece about that long, and I'm going to chop it off there. And then you want your C and your D rectangles to do the same thing. I want a 4.5 inch. Okay, so I am going to put that right, and I'm going to use the fabric side down on this one when I sew, and that will give me an easier time sewing through the fabric. So okay, I am testing one other bit. So let's see here. Yeah, you only want, I started with a piece that was 2 inches wide, and you only want a piece that's 1.5 inches wide. So I need to I will have to make sure I update my pattern with those instructions. And this is a little bit tricky here. Yes, Lori worked retail. Enjoy those quiet days. Okay, so I've got my A and my B. Okay, so as you can see, I want to get this B section lined up even with the top of my block here that I've already sewn to this center strip. And I'm going to line that. It doesn't have to be exact, but as best as you can, get those pieces aligned and you will be happier with your results. Okay, and then same thing on this one. I need to trim down my outside piece. And again, I want to make that a square corner as best I can. So even though my center strip here is longer, I want to keep this oriented even with the portion that's already there. I just want to extend that line and make sure I'm hitting it there so I don't have a wildly crooked corner for my block. Oh, look at that. My thread ran out right at the edge of my seam. I should go buy a lottery ticket, and that Powerball is a good jackpot. So let's rethread the machine quickly here so we can keep going. Gotta use your Jedi mind tricks to get that needle threaded sometimes. Okay. Okay, so there is one corner of our snowflake. And this is a little bit of improv. So you can see that this part goes down a little bit lower than that. So it's going to look a little bit like a wonky kid's drawing of a snowflake. But this one I got a little bit closer to straight there. But that's part of the charm. You know, no two snowflakes are identical. So we have a little bit of asymmetry going on. Then I want to double check my you want your I'm going to be using scant seams on this. I'm just a little bit off, but you need to trim these to an exact size. So that's what I am checking here with my ruler, and all those details are in the pattern. Okay, so those two corners are done, and then we will repeat the process. I know, yeah, that one's quite a bit. Okay, this happened on my sample too. You can see that one corner I didn't quite have enough to make the seam allowance, so I added a piece of fabric, and I'm ending up doing the same thing again, but I was looking through my scraps to see if I had a big enough piece, but we'll just use the edge of this one just because I don't want to lose that, you know, have danger of losing that corner. Oh, it was right here. I want to sew. Okay, this is my little Band-Aid fix so that I have a full corner there and don't lose any of my seam allowance when I trim these. I'm just checking my math. Yeah, I trimmed that one too big, so we will cut it down and cut this one down as well. Okay. And then I need to add my center sections. I'm going to have to go update the pattern. For this part, so that it makes sense about how you position these center strips. So I'm starting with a narrower strip than I did the first time around, and I'm just centering it on this, not really centered because I have a little bit more of a tail at one end than the other, but you definitely want a tail hanging off both ends of your piece as you sew that together with its 1/4 inch seam. want to make sure that we have our C and D. So B is off to the side. B and D get set aside. A and C go first. So those to the center strip. Okay, and now this was the A, so I make sure I grab my B corner, and I am keeping it positioned a little bit above where the A section left off so that I can get my full corner there when we are trimming our blocks. Okay, we just eyeball the two branches of our little snowflake edge and position that. And again, my reference points are where this fabric is. I can make sure that I am in line with that on both the top and the bottom. And then your snowflake should be in the right place. Okay, so there is another corner of our snowflake. I am pressing these towards that center strip of fabric that I added, and then I'm going to trim them down to the specified size for the corners. And I am noticing I am short on this one. So I am going to trim that piece at both. And then I can, did I have a long enough scrap? No, I thought I had set aside some rectangles there, but I can just trim a piece and add this along the bottom. So there's a lot of kind of problem solving that we can do with our blocks when they're just in this stage of a unit and not an overall block. That will save us some headaches when we put the whole thing together. And since we were doing this kind of improvisationally, we end up with things that are a little bit off. You may need to use scant seam allowances, or, you know, add a little bit of extra fabric to the edge to make it all work out. Okay, there we go. So I can take my 4 sections here. Got lots of scraps to deal with. And my pre-cut pieces. This is looking, yeah, why did I cut those too big? I don't know, but at least I noticed now. And oh no, because it was. I was looking at, I read my instructions wrong. When it said cut 2, I thought it meant 2 inches. No, it meant 2 pieces, 1.5 inches. So that's why I got that one screwed up. Okay. So then we want an AB and a CD, like I have right there. And we're going to put a strip in the middle. And we're going to make 2 rows like that. And then we're going to add 1 more horizontal row across. So here we go. With that, and remember, if you were using scant seams, leave yourself a little bit of wiggle room there. And here is the one that I added some extra to the bottom so that I would have better results. Make sure I am reading the correct edge of the ruler. I'm really fussing with this one to get it the way I want it. There we go. There we go. Trim another 1/8 of an inch off of that end, and our so I've got my A section piece to there, and then I can add the CD section to this other side. Is that whole thing too short? No, it just needs the scant seam. You can see how that section worked out where I didn't quite get the block long enough. So if I had kept a longer tail here and a better section there, I'm not sure why that is happening. If maybe it's the way I place these triangles. I need to offset them a little more to make that. Yeah, you can see if I had moved this horizontal bar down to be level with this white, I would have been much better off. But like I said, our snowflakes can be a little bit wonky sometimes. Okay, so now we have our two sections. Top half and bottom half of our snowflake. And we will add our middle row to connect those. I've got the final row on my snowflake. And there we go. Like I said, I do have that one wonky spot here. And you know what I could do to cheat? I could fill that in with thread. I could just, quilt white thread right over the top of that, and it will be just fine. But I will write the pattern, and you can see exactly why that block got screwed up, because this white bar did not square up with that other side of my block. So lesson learned to adjust and be a little more careful on that. So the last step with any paper piece pattern is to rip off the paper. And then, because I don't have a plan for these blocks yet, they're samples for the tutorials, for the pattern tutorials, I'm going to stay stitch 1/8 of an inch around the whole block, and that will just keep it secure until I am ready to move on from this. And I may end up ripping this corner out and redoing it with white fabric there, because that looks really bizarre to have that corner all green in there. But thank you for hanging out with me while I work on the Holidaze Sampler. One last view of the whole quilt. We've worked on the candle and the snowflake block today, and that means that the star is coming very soon. Christmas Eve, tune in for that last tutorial. Thanks so much for being here and happy holidays.